In the early years of the 20th century, the world believed it was entering an age of progress, reason, and unstoppable human advancement. Cities across Europe glittered with electric lights. Factories roared with productivity, and science promised a brighter future. Beneath this confident surface, however, something dangerous was growing. Old empires were cracking. New powers were rising. And beneath polite diplomacy and royal ceremonies, Europe was quietly preparing for catastrophe. For decades, Europe had been building toward war without realizing it, or perhaps without wanting to admit it. National pride had hardened into nationalism, convincing entire populations that their nation was superior and destined to dominate others. Empires such as Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire ruled over many ethnic groups who no longer wished to be governed by distant rulers. These internal tensions turned borders into fault lines, ready to snap under pressure. At the same time, global competition intensified. The world's great powers raced to claim colonies in Africa and Asia, believing land meant power and survival. Britain ruled the seas. France guarded its empire in Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, felt surrounded and threatened. Each nation interpreted the ambitions of others as direct danger to its own future. This fear drove militarism to unprecedented levels. European armies grew enormous. Generals gained political influence. New weapons were developed faster than strategies to control them. Military parades filled capital cities, presenting war as honorable and heroic. Few questioned what modern weapons would actually do to the human body once war finally came. To protect themselves, nations bound their futures to alliances. These were meant as deterrents, but instead they formed rigid chains. If one nation went to war, its allies were obligated to follow. Europe was divided into two armed blocs, facing each other with suspicion and confidence, each believing the other would blink first. None understood how little room remained for diplomacy. By 1914, leaders believed war would be brief. Many thought it could even solve long-standing problems. Politicians assumed economic interdependence would prevent prolonged fighting. Generals promised victory by Christmas. The world had forgotten the true cost of war because it had not yet experienced industrial-scale killing. Then came June 28, 1914. In Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary arrived for an official visit. To many it seemed routine. To others, especially nationalist groups seeking independence, it was a provocation. As the Archduke's car moved through the city streets, a young man named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward and fired 2 bullets. Within moments, the heir to one of Europe's greatest empires lay dead. The assassination shocked Europe, but it did not have to lead to world war. What followed was a failure of leadership, restraint, and imagination. Austria-Hungary saw the killing as an opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. Germany offered unconditional support. Russia prepared to defend Serbia. Diplomacy gave way to ultimatums. In July 1914, political decisions moved faster than human consequences. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia, then France. When German troops crossed into neutral Belgium, Britain could no longer stay out. Within days, a regional crisis had become a global firestorm. As war declarations spread, crowds filled the streets of Berlin, Paris, London, and Vienna. There was cheering, singing, and celebration. Young men enlisted willingly, convinced they were part of a historic moment. Newspapers spoke of honor and destiny. Almost no one spoke of death. What followed defied every expectation. The first weeks of fighting shattered the illusion of a short war. Railways delivered millions of soldiers to the front lines. Artillery thundered day and night. Casualties mounted at a rate unseen in human history. Modern warfare revealed itself not as heroic, but mechanical and indifferent. The war that was supposed to unite nations instead consumed them. Families were torn apart. Economies strained. Governments tightened control at home while asking unimaginable sacrifices from their people. And this was only the beginning. By the end of 1914, Europe stood locked in a conflict it could no longer stop. The optimism of summer turned into the horror of winter. Soldiers dug into the earth to survive, unaware that they would remain there for years. The world had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. World War I had begun, not with understanding, but with arrogance, not with necessity, but with fear. And the price humanity was about to pay would be beyond anything it had ever known. By the end of 1914, the hope of a quick and decisive war had collapsed. Across Western Europe, armies no longer advanced. They dug in, from the northern coast of France to the mountains of Switzerland. Hundreds of miles of trenches cut the land into scars of mud, fear, and death. What began as temporary shelter became a permanent prison for millions of men. These trenches were not heroic fortifications. They were places of survival. Soldiers lived buried in the earth, surrounded by cold, darkness, and decay. Rain turned the ground into thick sludge that swallowed boots and bodies alike. The smell of rotting flesh, unwashed soldiers, and stagnant water filled the air. Disease spread rapidly, and rat infestations became constant companions. In these conditions, morale slowly eroded. Between opposing trench lines lay a strip of ground known as no man's land. It was a barren wasteland churned by endless shelling and littered with barbed wire, shattered equipment, and corpses left where they fell. Crossing this ground during an attack required leaving the relative safety of the trench and walking into a storm of bullets, artillery fire, and death. Most who tried never made it halfway. Military leaders struggled to adapt to this new reality. Their strategies were built on older wars, where soldiers advanced in formations and battles were decided by movement and maneuver. Modern weapons destroyed these ideas completely. Machine guns fired hundreds of rounds per minute, cutting down charging soldiers with terrifying efficiency. Artillery became the true killer of the war, raining explosive shells over vast areas without warning. Battles were planned with optimistic expectations and ended with catastrophic losses. At Verdun, one of the longest and bloodiest battles in history, French and German forces fought for nearly 12 months over ground measured in meters. The objective was no longer victory, but exhaustion, the deliberate attempt to bleed the enemy dry. More than 700,000 men were killed or wounded. Verdun became a symbol of endless suffering. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 further revealed the grim reality of industrial warfare. After a week-long artillery bombardment intended to destroy German defenses, British and Allied forces attacked at dawn. The bombardment failed. German machine guns remained intact. By nightfall on the first day, the British Army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the worst single day in its history. The battlefield did not move. As the stalemate continued, nations searched desperately for new methods to break it. This desperation led to the introduction of weapons that shocked even those who used them. Poison gas was released in the trenches, drifting silently before burning lungs and blinding eyes. Gas masks became as essential as rifles, yet many soldiers were caught unprotected. Survivors often lived with lifelong damage, gasping for breath years after the war ended. Tanks appeared the first time on the battlefield, slow, unreliable steel beasts designed to cross trenches and break through barbed wire. Early models were crude and prone to failure, but they represented a glimpse of the future of warfare. Meanwhile, in the skies above, airplanes evolved from reconnaissance tools into weapons of combat. Dogfights became symbols of individual bravery in a war otherwise defined by mass death. Daily life for soldiers was a relentless cycle of waiting and terror. Long periods of boredom were broken by sudden bombardments and surprise attacks. Sleep was scarce. Letters from home offered comfort, but also deepened feelings of isolation. Many soldiers suffered from what was then called shell shock, a psychological collapse caused by constant explosions and fear. This invisible wound was poorly understood and often punished rather than treated. Behind the front lines, entire societies were being consumed by the war effort. Factories shifted to weapon production, women entered industrial jobs in unprecedented numbers, and civilians endured shortages and rationing. Children grew up without fathers. Entire communities were defined by loss. The war spared no one. Despite the brutality, commanders continued to believe that one final push would bring victory. Instead, each offensive dragged nations deeper into the same nightmare. The trenches did not just shape the battlefield. They reshaped the human spirit. The old ideas of honor and glory were buried in the mud alongside the dead. By 1916, It was clear that the war had become a contest of endurance rather than strategy. Victory would belong not to the clever, but to those who could suffer the longest. And as the world watched armies disappear into the earth, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a war between soldiers. It was a war against humanity itself. By the middle of the conflict, it was clear that World War I could no longer be contained within the trenches of Western Europe. What began as a fight between neighboring empires spread across continents, oceans, and colonies. The war followed trade routes, imperial borders, and political ambitions, dragging much of the world into a struggle they neither started nor fully understood. On the Eastern Front, the war took a different and equally brutal form. Unlike the static trench lines in the West, fighting between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia was more fluid and chaotic. Armies advanced and retreated across vast distances, yet the cost in human life was staggering. Russian soldiers, often poorly trained and badly equipped, were sent into battle with limited weapons and almost no protection. Losses mounted rapidly, exposed by weak leadership and an overstretched supply system. As defeats accumulated, confidence in the Russian government collapsed. Soldiers deserted. Civilians faced severe food shortages, and trust in the Tsar evaporated. By 1917, revolution had erupted at home. The old Russian order fell apart, leading to the collapse of the monarchy and the rise of the Bolsheviks. Russia's withdrawal from the war was not a strategic choice, but a symptom of internal collapse. Further south, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, turning the Middle East into a major theater of conflict. Battles raged across Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. The Allies aimed to secure trade routes and weaken Ottoman control, while local populations were pulled into a war that reshaped their future without their consent. The Gallipoli campaign, in particular, became a tragic failure, costing tens of thousands of lives and leaving a deep mark on national memory in countries such as Australia and New Zealand. Across the Middle East, the war ignited promises and betrayals. Arab leaders were encouraged to revolt against Ottoman rule with assurances of independence, while secret agreements carved the region into zones of European influence. These decisions, made far from the battlefield, would shape political instability for generations to come. The war also crossed into Africa, where European colonies became battlegrounds. Colonial troops were mobilized, often forcibly, to fight for imperial powers. Many soldiers had little understanding of why they were fighting or who the enemy truly was. Entire regions were destabilized, resources drained, and civilian populations suffered from famine and forced labor, all consequences of a war driven by distant capitals. At sea, warfare became just as deadly and unpredictable. Germany's submarine campaign sought to destroy Allied supply lines by sinking merchant vessels without warning. The oceans, once symbols of connection, turned into killing grounds. Neutral nations were dragged toward involvement as their ships were destroyed and civilians drowned far from any battlefield. For years, the United States watched the war from a distance. American leaders hoped to avoid entanglement in European conflicts, but neutrality grew increasingly difficult to maintain. Trade partnerships tied the U.S. economy to the Allies, while German submarine attacks pushed public opinion closer to intervention. When a secret German offered to Mexico propose war against America in exchange for lost territory, the final restraint collapsed. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I. The decision marked a turning point. While American forces were not immediately decisive, their arrival shifted the balance of morale and industrial strength. For the first time, the Central Powers faced an enemy with fresh soldiers and nearly unlimited resources. As the war expanded, the strain on empires intensified. Austria-Hungary struggled to control its diverse population as nationalist movements threatened to tear it apart. The Ottoman Empire began to crack under military defeat and internal decay. Even Germany, once confident and disciplined, felt the weight of prolonged war and economic isolation. World War I became a conflict not just of armies, but of entire systems. Nations mobilized their economies, controlled information, and demanded total loyalty from their people. Civilians were no longer protected by distance. Hunger, propaganda, and fear reached every household. By 1917, The war had reshaped the global order. Old empires trembled. New powers emerged. Borders were questioned not in negotiations, but through violence. And while victory or defeat remained uncertain, one truth was clear. The world that existed before 1914 was gone forever. The fighting continued, but the direction of history had changed. The war no longer asked who would win, but what would survive. By 1917, World War I had reached a state of exhaustion. After 3 years of relentless fighting, Europe was bleeding itself dry. Entire generations had vanished in the soil of battlefields, while those who survived carried wounds visible and unseen. Governments promised endurance. But beneath the surface, societies were cracking under pressure. The war had become too large, too destructive, and too consuming to sustain indefinitely. Germany, once confident of swift victory, now faced immense challenges. The British naval blockade tightened its grip, cutting off vital supplies of food and raw materials. Civilians endured hunger, malnutrition, and unrest. Factories struggled. Morale declined. The promise of triumph that had fueled early enthusiasm faded into anger and doubt. In a desperate attempt to break the deadlock, Germany turned to unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats were ordered to sink any ship, neutral or enemy, entering Allied waters. The strategy aimed to starve Britain into surrender, but it carried enormous risk. Civilians were killed at sea, outrage spread, and neutral nations were pushed closer to war. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was undergoing its own transformation. Although initially committed to neutrality, American industry had become deeply tied to the Allied cause. As German attacks intensified and diplomatic provocations mounted, political resistance eroded. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, entering the conflict not with immediate force, but with overwhelming potential. American soldiers did not arrive in massive numbers overnight, but their presence changed everything. For exhausted Allied troops, the knowledge that fresh forces were coming restored hope. For Germany, it created a ticking clock. Victory now had to come quickly or not at all. In early 1918, with Russia out of the war, Germany launched one final, massive offensive on the Western Front. Hundreds of thousands of troops surged forward in a desperate gamble to defeat the Allies before American power could fully mobilize. Initially, the attack shocked Allied defenses. Ground was regained. Paris was once again threatened. But the offensive carried a fatal flaw. Germany lacked the resources to sustain it. Troops advanced faster than supplies could follow. Losses mounted rapidly. And when the advance finally stalled, Germany had no reserves left. The Allies responded with coordinated counterattacks, supported by tanks, aircraft, and unified command. American troops now fought in large numbers, bringing reinforcements that Germany could not match. Slowly, relentlessly, the Central Powers were pushed back. As the battlefield situation deteriorated, collapse spread beyond the front lines. Austria-Hungary began to fracture as nationalist movements sought independence. The Ottoman Empire, weakened by defeat and internal decay, could no longer maintain control. Bulgaria surrendered. One ally after another fell away. Inside Germany, unrest exploded. Civilians protested food shortages. Workers went on strike. Soldiers at the front questioned why they were still fighting. Discipline eroded. Confidence in leadership evaporated. The war effort no longer seemed meaningful, only endless. In November 1918, revolution reached Germany itself. The Kaiser abdicated and fled into exile. With no allies left and no hope of victory, Germany sought an end of fighting. On the morning of November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed in a railway carriage in France. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. After 4 years of unrelenting violence, World War I came to an end. Celebrations erupted across Allied nations, but the joy was subdued. Too many were missing. Too many cities lay in ruins. Too much had been lost to fully celebrate. Victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival. The battlefield was quiet, but the war was not truly over. Millions of refugees wandered shattered landscapes. Soldiers returned home changed beyond recognition. Nations faced the impossible task of rebuilding not just cities, but entire societies. The world stood at a crossroads. Peace had come, but it was fragile. Decisions made in the aftermath would determine whether this catastrophe remained a warning or a prelude. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world did not return to peace. It stepped instead into uncertainty. Across Europe, entire regions lay in ruins. Cities were scarred by bombardment. Farmland was poisoned by shells, and millions of survivors searched for a future that no longer resembled the past. Victory did not erase suffering. It revealed its scale. The human cost of World War I was staggering. Over 16 million people were dead, including soldiers and civilians. Millions more were wounded, mutilated, or psychologically broken. Hospitals overflowed with the blind, the burned, and the permanently damaged. Families grieved without bodies to bury. A generation had been sacrificed to a war few truly understood. As leaders gathered in Paris to shape the post-war world, the task before them was immense. They faced the challenge of punishing the defeated without destroying the peace, of rewarding the victorious without creating resentment. Yet the treaties that emerged reflected anger, fear, and political compromise more than healing. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, placed the greatest burden on Germany. The nation was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, surrender territory, dismantle its military, and pay massive reparations. These terms humiliated a proud society already suffering from hunger and loss. Rather than stabilizing Europe, the treaty deepened bitterness and fueled a growing sense of injustice. Meanwhile, the collapse of empires reshaped the global map. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared, replaced by new states struggling to define their identities and borders. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled, its lands divided by foreign powers with little regard for ethnic or religious realities. In Eastern Europe and the Middle East, borders were drawn that would later become sources of conflict and instability. The Russian Empire was replaced by the Soviet Union, marking the rise of a new ideological power that challenged existing political systems. Revolutions and unrest spread beyond Russia, as workers and soldiers across Europe questioned the values that had led them into slaughter. The war also transformed societies in lasting ways. Women had filled factories, farms, and offices during conflict, challenging traditional gender roles. Many refused to return quietly to pre-war expectations. Technology advanced rapidly under wartime pressure, changing industry, communication, and medicine. Yet these advancements stood in stark contrast to the moral collapse that had allowed industrial killing to flourish. Perhaps the greatest legacy of World War I was psychological. The belief in continuous progress shattered. Trust in leaders eroded. Art, literature, and philosophy reflected deep disillusionment. The war taught humanity that modern civilization could produce not just comfort and efficiency, but destruction on an unprecedented scale. Despite hopes that the conflict had ended all wars, peace proved fragile. Economic crises, political extremism, and unresolved grievances spread through Europe. Nations turned inward, angry and afraid. The world had learned how to fight a total war, but not how to prevent another. Within 2 decades, the unresolved tensions of World War I would return with even greater force. The bitterness left by the Treaty of Versailles, combined with economic hardship and nationalist rage, would help ignite World War II. The second global conflict would eclipse the first in scale, but its roots lay deeply buried in the decisions made after 1918. World War I stands as a warning written in blood. It shows how pride can overpower reason, how fear can destroy diplomacy, and how modern technology can transform conflict into catastrophe. The war reshaped borders, shattered empires, and permanently altered the human experience. More than a century later, its lessons remain urgent. Peace is not preserved by strength alone, but by understanding, justice, and restraint. When those fail, the cost is measured not in victories, but in lives. The Great War ended the old world and introduced a new, unstable era. Its echoes still shape global politics, international relations, and collective memory. And as history continues to unfold, World War I remains a reminder how easily civilization can descend into darkness and how difficult it is to climb back out. If this documentary helped you understand the true cost of war, consider supporting the channel. Like the video, share it with those who value history, and subscribe for more in-depth documentaries like this. Thank you for watching.